In order to motivate the material that we will study in this course, consider the following thought experiment. You are a member of the Starship Enterprise, much like Captain Kirk in Star Trek, and you travel through space, you reach a new M planet, and you are given the opportunity to start a complete new civilization there, a complete new world from scratch. And not only that, you are given absolute power. You can get to decide exactly how this new world looks like, from top to bottom. The dream of a dictator come through, if you wish. Now, among the many things that you will have to decide to construct such a world, you're going to have to answer what we call the three fundamental economic questions. These questions are what, how, or for whom. And let me explain what they mean. You're going to have to decide what kinds of goods and services is this society going to produce. For example, are you going to allow some types of musics to be produced or some types of films? Are you going to allow cars that use fossil fuels, etc., etc., etc.? Exactly what are the goods and services that will be produced? The second question that you're going to have to decide is how are these things going to be produced? For example, are you going to produce energy using nuclear technology, or are you only going to allow solar panels? Who exactly is going to do each job to produce these things? Is this particular person going to be an engineer? It's going to be a cashier. It's going to be a politician, etc., etc., etc. And the final thing that you will have to decide is for whom. Of all the lists of things, goods and services that get produced, who exactly gets to consume everything? Who gets the nicest car? Who gets the worst car? Who gets no car at all? Who gets to read the best books first? Etc., etc., etc. I hope that you are getting a feeling that even the indefeatable Captain Kirk would become extremely overwhelmed by trying to solve the three basic economic questions. It's a very hard problem. Imagine in a world of several billion people like our planet, trying to design and solve these questions for every one of the billions and billions of decisions that have to be made. And yet, if you were Captain Kirk and you were given that mission, you have to find a way of answering the three fundamental economic questions. There is no way around it. Every social group, every human society that has ever existed has had to address them. Now, there is a wide range of potential institutions that Captain Kirk could set up to try to solve the three fundamental questions, and in fact that human societies has used throughout time to solve these problems. And you can, for convenience, line them up in a continuum that go from one extreme of what we call pure command and control to another extreme that we're going to call pure laissez-faire or pure free trade. Okay, pure free trade. And let me explain what these continuums or those extremes mean. Now, in pure command and control here, there is basically a small group that decides everything. So it could be a dictator, it could be a government that is elected or not, but the key thing is not the free decisions of many people that determine what the solution to the questions are. There is a small group that somehow sits there and decides what will be produced, how it will be produced, and for whom it will be produced. At the other extreme is pure laissez-faire or free trade, in which there is no single group that gets to tell others what, how, and for whom to produce. Instead, is the individual free actions and the trades and the agreements that people reach that determine the outcome of the three economic questions. Now, throughout history, there has been a lot of institutions lying at very different points in this line that have been tried. And let me give you a few examples. Old Mother Russia, communist Russia, was an example of institution or a country that was not exactly at the corner, that is almost impossible to achieve, but was pretty close to that. And for example, Russia used to have this thing called 5-year plans, in which there was a central government office that would sit down and try to really plan what should the government and the country produce for the next 5 years. Now, there is also not a single economy that has existed in the world, as far as I know, that has been a pure laissez-faire. But the United States, comes fairly decent to be in that extreme. especially if you do cross-international comparisons. And it's an economy that in which the government regulates and restricts some forms of trade, imposes some taxes, etc. But most of the three fundamental economic questions are addressed through the market, through the free trading of individuals. Now, almost all modern economies lie in some part of the continuum here and rely very heavily on free trade, but they come in different flavors. Like, for example, France is an economy that relies heavily on free trade. It's a market economy, but in which the government plays a much, much higher role in solving the three economic questions, in the allocations of resources, in restricting trade, than it does in the United States. Now, as I just mentioned, free markets and trading have become an essential part of how resources get allocated in most modern countries and economies. So basic economics is motivated by understanding the performance and the outcomes generated by those markets. And just to give you a feeling for how pervasive these markets are, I just wanted to show you some pictures of markets across the world. This first picture is of a market in Afghanistan, a country that is and has been for the last few decades really ravaged by war and government problems, and yet there you have it. People trading in markets trying to solve the three fundamental economic questions. So the beautiful picture is of what is called a floating market for agricultural products and like vegetables and fruits in Thailand. Here is a picture of what most people would consider the quintessential market. This is a picture of the New York stock market, and this very organized, computerized, extremely efficient way in which the world trades stocks through this institution. And you know, even over the last decade or so, the advent of the web and very sophisticated programming technologies have allowed the creation of markets like, for example, eBay, in which people can trade all sorts of things. So a lot of the economics that we're going to study is about understanding how well do these markets perform and what kinds of outcomes they generate. Our understanding and study of markets is organized around 9 units, 1 unit per week, that look like follows. First, we're going to spend 4 weeks in what I would call part 1 of the course, basically studying what are called competitive markets, which are a series of markets that basically work extremely well. And we're going to learn that a certain set of assumptions that hold very widely, markets actually perform very well. And we're going to understand exactly why that is the case. Now, in the second part of the course, we're going to ask the question of what is the effect of government intervention in those pervasive competitive markets? And ask, is there a role for government intervention? What kinds of things can the government do to help in those markets, if any at all? Now, we're also going to learn in the process of understanding competitive markets that not every market satisfies the properties, the assumptions that are required for good outcomes to be generated. And what we're going to do in the last part of the course is study what happens when the three fundamental questions are solved with markets that do not satisfy the competitive assumptions. And in particular, we're going to look at 3 types of markets. Markets in which there are not enough people, there are very few players in some segments. For example, it may only be one firm producing the goods. Those are called markets with imperfect competition. We're also going to look at markets that have a feature called externalities. And those are markets in which some people can affect the well-being of others without their permission, without trading. This happens a lot, for example, in environmental markets, in situations, let's say like when you drive your car by gasoline, where you can impose damage on others without their consent, and those are called externalities. And we're going to study how well do markets perform there, and what is the role of government policy in helping the performance of those markets improve. And finally, in the last section, we're going to study markets with what is known as asymmetric information. One of the things that we're going to learn in this first part of the course is that for markets to perform well, it's very important that when people meet to decide what to trade and at what prices to trade, they need to know exactly what they are buying, and both people have to have basically similar information. There are some markets, and a prototypical example is the used cars sales market, in which that assumption is not met. The sellers or the cars, for example, know a lot more about the car that they are selling, whether it's a lemon or not, whether it has problems, than the buyers, and that causes some problems. We're going to study what happens in those markets, and again, the role of government policy in those markets in the last unit of the course. In the process of developing the models and the theory necessary to answer all of the questions that we just described, we're also going to develop a tool set, a set of models and skills that we're going to apply to a large number of questions that I think are of interest. And I just wanted to give you here a sample of some of the applications that we're going to do that I think you may find interesting. Question: is legalizing drugs a good idea? Should the government tax drugs, do nothing, and just let people trade? Should they make them illegal? What are the consequences of the different regimes? Here's another example. If you travel in an airplane, it's very likely that the person sitting next to you in the plane is not paying the same amount for the airfare that you did, because airlines engage in what is called price discrimination. They really try to maximize the amount of money that they get out of every customer. Is that a good or a bad idea? Should the government forbid it? Let me give you another example. What should be the optimal gasoline tax? Should it be zero, or should it be several dollars like it's in some European countries? Final example. Every year, companies like Apple introduce new technologies constantly. What is the value to society of such products, for example, like the iPhone? Now, the tools that we're going to develop in this course are going to allow you to, I hope, gain a quantum leap of understanding in your ability of how to answer questions such as this one. So I hope you are excited about the course, certainly as excited as I am, and without more preamble, let's jump to Unit 1 and do some economics.